The operating room lights were still buzzing when the governor of Callaway State stopped breathing. 43 seconds. That was how long the room stood frozen. Surgeons staring at monitors, a scrub tech pressing herself against the wall, the lead physician backing away from the table like the body in front of him had already become someone else's problem. Outside that door, in the corridor still smelling of antiseptic and old coffee, a security officer had just shoved a nurse toward the elevator with one hand and a smirk on his face. She'd tried to warn them, twice. Nobody listened. Nobody ever does, until the alarms start screaming and the only person who knows what to do is the one they just threw out. If this story already has you gripped, stay with me until the very end. Hit follow so you don't miss what happens next, and if you enjoy what you're watching, give it a like. And drop a comment right now telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. The first thing Brooke Halstead noticed about Callaway Regional Medical Center was the smell. Not antiseptic. Every hospital smelled like that. This was something underneath it, something stale and institutional, like rules that had calcified into walls. She'd worked in a forward operating base outside a combat zone where the supply tent collapsed during a sandstorm, and they'd performed emergency thoracic work by flashlight. She knew the difference between a place that ran on discipline and a place that ran on hierarchy. Callaway Regional ran on hierarchy. She knew that before she'd even found the locker room. It was a Tuesday in early March, overcast and cold in the way that Callaway City did overcast and cold. Not dramatic, just relentless. Brooke had driven in the night before, slept 4 hours in the extended stay motel off Route 9, and arrived 40 minutes early for her orientation because she always arrived early. Old habit. One of many. She was 34, medium height, lean in the way that came from practical movement rather than deliberate exercise. Her hair was dark and cut short enough that it stayed out of her face without clips. She walked through hospital corridors the way she'd walked through a lot of places. Aware of her surroundings, aware of exits, not making a production of either. The nursing director who processed her paperwork was named Sandra Voss, a compact woman in her late 50s who had the practiced warmth of someone who'd given the same orientation speech 300 times and had stopped meaning most of it somewhere around repetition 40. "You'll be on the surgical floor," Sandra said, sliding a badge across the desk. "Third shift rotates into day coverage starting your second week. You'll shadow Tara Osei for the first 3 days. She's been here 8 years, knows the floor better than anyone." "That works," Brooke said. Sandra looked at her resume. Then she looked at it again. "Says here you were in the military. Army, combat medic, then trauma nursing. 2 deployments." Sandra set the paper down. "Well, things run a little differently here than in the field, I'd imagine." It wasn't exactly hostile. It was the thing people said when they didn't know what else to say. A small repositioning that meant this place has its own rules, and I need you to understand that from the start. Brooke understood it. She'd heard some version of it in every civilian medical position she'd ever interviewed for. "I'm a fast learner," she said. Sandra smiled the orientation smile. "Good. There's a mandatory security briefing at 9. Officer Brent Yeager runs it. He's our lead security coordinator for the surgical wing. I'd suggest making a good impression." Brooke picked up her badge. "I'll do my best." Until she met Tara Osei at the nurses' station on 3, and the introduction went better than most. Tara was early 40s, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped natural hair, and the kind of practiced efficiency that made you realize immediately she'd been carrying the weight of this floor for longer than anyone had bothered to acknowledge. "New hire?" Tara said, not looking up from the chart she was annotating. "Brooke Halstead. You late?" "No." "Good start." Tara clicked her pen closed and finally looked at her. Something in the assessment was fast and thorough, the kind of read that came from years of sizing up who could handle pressure and who would freeze. Whatever she found, she didn't voice it. "Come on, I'll show you where they hide the working blood pressure cuffs." The surgical floor at Callaway Regional was a controlled version of chaos, the morning rush of pre-op prep, the rotating cast of orderlies and residents and attending physicians passing each other in corridors with the particular focus of people trying to look busier than they were. Brooke absorbed it the way she absorbed most environments, systematically, cataloging the things that worked and the things that were held together with tape and optimism. The equipment logged at Station 3 had calibration tags 3 months overdue. 2 of the IV pumps in the prep bay had amber warning lights that nobody appeared to be looking at. The sterile supply closet had a badge access log that hadn't been updated since January. She didn't say any of this out loud. She filed it. The security briefing was in a conference room off the main corridor at 9 sharp. 6 new staff members sat in folding chairs while Brent Yeager stood at the front of the room with the posture of a man who considered himself the most important person in any room he occupied. Yeager was somewhere in his mid-40s, thick through the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been built specifically for clenching. He wore his hospital security uniform like a military rank he hadn't actually earned, badge buffed to a shine, keyring clipped to his belt with military precision, which Brooke recognized immediately as the aesthetic of military precision rather than the genuine article. She'd seen enough of both. He talked for 20 minutes about access protocols, visitor restrictions, surgical floor security clearances, and the importance of following chain of command. Most of it was reasonable. Some of it was not. Medical staff do not engage with security situations, he said. You see something, you call us. You don't intervene. You don't play hero. That goes especially for nursing staff. He let that land. Then he looked directly at Brooke. She hadn't said anything. She'd been sitting in the second row with her arms crossed, listening. You're the new one, Yeager said. Brooke Halstead. Says you were in the Army. That's right. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Well, this isn't the Army, Halstead. You're a nurse here. You take vitals and follow physician orders and you stay in your lane. We clear? The room was very quiet. 3 of the other new hires were looking at their laps. We're clear, Brooke said. Good. He moved on, but the look he gave her when he turned away said he wasn't finished. The first 3 days were positioning. That was the only word for it. Brooke watched and learned and stayed in her lane, because Tara had been right that the floor had its rhythms, and it took time to understand them. She was good at the work. She'd always been good at the work, and she didn't make a point of demonstrating it. She picked up the protocols, learned which residents were competent and which were dangerous, and figured out that Dr. Victor Kane, the chief of cardiothoracic surgery, ran his OR like a personal fiefdom. Kane was 52, silver-haired, and performed exactly the confident physician he'd decided he was sometime in his 30s. He walked the surgical floor with the particular authority of a man who had never seriously been wrong about anything, which meant he'd arranged his environment so that no one brought him evidence to the contrary. His residents deferred to him reflexively. His scrub techs anticipated his preferences. His attending nurses had learned, through what Brooke suspected had been some painful lessons, to present information in the exact framing he found acceptable. He didn't interact with her directly in the first 3 days. She was new staff and she was nursing, which meant she existed in a category he didn't need to concern himself with. That changed on Thursday. She'd been doing morning rounds with Tara when she spotted something in the pre-op bay. The patient was a 61-year-old man scheduled for a valve repair. Relatively routine, the kind of procedure that Callaway Regional did 6 times a week. But the monitoring equipment they'd assigned to his bay had a power cycling issue she'd noticed twice before on this floor. A flicker. Subtle enough to miss if you weren't looking for it, significant enough to matter if it happened during a critical procedure. She flagged it to this charge nurse, a young man named Philip, who had the look of someone perpetually one problem away from a breakdown. I think the hemodynamic monitor in Bay 4 needs to be checked before Dr. Kane's procedure this afternoon, she said. Philip looked at the monitor, looked at her. It's running fine. It's cycling, see that? She pointed to the display where the waveform had just blipped, a half-second irregularity. It's done that 3 times since this morning. If it does that during active surgery, you lose continuous readout. I'll make a note. I'd recommend pulling it and swapping in the backup unit. Philip's expression did something complicated. Not hostile exactly, more like someone who understood the problem but was doing math about whether solving it was worth the friction. I'll check with the supervisor, he said. The monitor stayed in Bay 4. That afternoon, Brooke was at the nurse's station when Kane walked past with his resident, a nervous young woman named Dr. Priya Selvon, who carried her tablet like a shield. The 2 o'clock is prepped? Kane said, not stopping. Yes, Dr. Kane, Selvin said, scrambling to keep pace. Brooke looked up. Dr. Kane, I had a concern about the monitoring equipment in Bay 4. The hemodynamic monitor has been showing a power cycling issue. Kane stopped, turned, looked at her with the specific brand of condescension reserved for people who had interrupted him. And you are? Brooke Halstead. I started Monday. The new nurse. He said it with the inflection of a man confirming a parking ticket had been issued to someone else's car. Thank you for your concern, Halstead. The equipment is inspected on a standard schedule. I think we can manage. I've documented 3 cycles this morning. Manage your patients, Kane said. I'll manage my OR. He walked away. Selvin gave Brooke a single apologetic glance that lasted about a half second before she followed. It was Yeager who made it official. He'd been watching the exchange from the corridor. She hadn't seen him standing there until Kane had already left, but Yeager had seen all of it. He waited until Brooke was alone at the station before he walked over and planted himself in front of her with his arms crossed. You've been here 4 days, he said. I have. And you're already trying to tell a 20-year attending physician how to run his operating room. I flagged a technical concern about equipment. You made a scene in front of the surgical floor staff. Brooke looked at him steadily. She had a very particular face for this kind of confrontation. Not aggressive, not deferential, just present. It tended to unsettle people who expected either. I mentioned an equipment issue to the attending physician. That's part of nursing protocol. Yeager stepped slightly closer. It was a dominance thing. She recognized it. He was a few inches taller, and he knew it. Let me explain how this works, he said, lowering his voice just enough to make it feel like something private. The doctors run the medicine here. Security runs the facility. Nursing staff support both. You don't correct physicians, you don't second-guess equipment inspections, and you especially don't come in here after 4 days thinking your Army experience qualifies you to tell anyone anything. Are we clear? You've asked me that before. I'm asking again. We're clear, she said. Same as before. Same tone. He held her gaze for a moment longer, then stepped back with the deliberate slowness of someone choosing not to do the thing they'd just considered. Good. Keep it that way. She watched him walk away and thought, he's done this before. Many times. And it's worked. That was the part that mattered. Not that Yeager was aggressive or territorial. She'd met men like him in every branch of the service and every hospital she'd ever worked in. What mattered was that it had worked enough times to become a default behavior, which meant the floor had been absorbing this for a long time, and no one with the standing to stop it had chosen to. She went back to her charts. Saturday brought the governor. Nathan Kress was the governor of Callaway State, 2 terms, 3rd in a contested primary, a man whose career had been built on the careful project of looking decisive while actually running very little risk. He'd been admitted to Callaway Regional Friday evening with chest discomfort that had escalated overnight into something the cardiologists were no longer comfortable monitoring conservatively. By Saturday morning, the surgical wing had acquired a different energy, extra security presence, a media van in the parking lot, and the particular institutional tension that came from a high-profile patient who needed something to go right. The procedure scheduled for 10 a.m. was an emergent valve repair. Kane was the surgeon. The OR team was Kane's usual crew with 2 additions, a cardiovascular anesthesiologist named Dr. Marcus Webb, who Brooke had heard was one of the few people on staff with genuine clinical authority, and a perfusionist named Diane Solis, who had been called in on her day off and was visibly annoyed about it. Brooke was not on the surgical team. She was covering the post-op recovery bays, which meant she was in adjacent territory, the same floor, 2 corridors over. She was also, as of 9:47 a.m., increasingly concerned about what she'd seen during the early morning setup. She'd been restocking supplies in the storage room adjacent to OR2 when the equipment cart for the governor's procedure had been rolled past. She'd gotten a clear look at the hemodynamic monitoring system, a newer unit, different from the one in Bay 4, but with the same manufacturer marking she'd learned to look for. And she'd seen the service sticker on the back panel. Last calibrated, November. It was March. She'd gone back to the nurse's station and pulled up the equipment log. The surgical monitors were supposed to be calibrated quarterly. The OR2 unit showed November as its last service date. A manual inspection request filed in January had a status note, reviewed, within operational parameters. She checked who had signed off on it. The signature was Yeager's. Security didn't sign off on medical equipment calibration. That wasn't how the system worked. She found Philip at the station. "Who's the equipment compliance officer for surgical?" Philip looked up from his computer. "Why?" "I need to know who to contact about a calibration discrepancy on the OR2 monitoring system." Something shifted in Philip's face. A flinch he tried to hide. "There's a compliance number in the directory, but Halstead—" He stopped. "What?" He glanced down the hallway. "Just be careful about which flags you raise and to whom. That's all I'm saying." "What does that mean?" But he'd already turned back to his screen. She tried Kane's office first, got his secretary, who told her the doctor was preparing for surgery and couldn't be reached. She tried the nursing supervisor on duty, a man named Gerald Ferris, who listened to her summary with the body language of someone waiting for a pause long enough to speak. "The equipment was cleared in January," he said, "by security, not by biomedical engineering." The process was followed. "Which process?" Gerald set his jaw. "The process we use here. If you have ongoing concerns, you can file a written complaint with the compliance office, Monday through Friday, 8 to 4. The procedure is in 40 minutes. Then I suggest you get back to your post-op assignments because you're going to have a patient in recovery in approximately 3 hours." She stood in the corridor for a moment after he walked away. The door to OR2 was visible from where she was standing. Through the small window in the door, she could see the setup crew running pre-procedure checks. Equipment arranged, monitoring leads connected, the overhead surgical lights blazing white against the sterile blue of the room. The monitor showed green across every readout. She thought about the power cycling in Bay 4. She thought about the signature on the calibration log. She thought about Philip's face when she'd asked the question. Then she went to find Tara. Tara listened to all of it without interrupting, which was how Brooke knew she'd already understood some portion of it on her own. "The calibration signature," Tara said when Brooke finished. "Yeager, not biomedical." Tara was quiet for a moment. "That equipment contractor, the one that services surgical, new vendor, started about 10 months ago, before my time. 6 weeks after the previous vendor flagged 2 units for decommission." Tara looked at the wall. "I put in a written concern in October. Nothing came back. You think someone's been approving defective equipment?" "I think I don't know enough to say that out loud to anyone official." Tara met her eyes. "And I think you've been here 6 days, Brooke. The governor goes under in 35 minutes. "I know." They looked at each other. There was a particular weight to the silence, the specific gravity of 2 people who understood the same thing and were doing the math about what it cost to act on it. "I'm going to the OR charge nurse," Brooke said. "Ferris already told you." "Not Ferris, Diane Solis. She's the perfusionist. If the hemodynamic monitoring fails during bypass, she needs to know there's a calibration question on that unit." Tara considered this for about 2 seconds. "Solis doesn't work here full-time. She's independent contract, which means she doesn't answer to Yeager." A beat. Second door past the scrub sinks. She should still be in prep. Brooke went. Solis was 53, gray-haired, with the contained competence of someone who had spent 30 years in perioperative care and had 0 patience for anything that wasted her time. She looked up from her equipment check when Brooke knocked on the open door. "I don't know you," Solis said. "Brooke Halstead. I've been here a week. I need 2 minutes." Something in Brooke's directness registered with Solis in a way that kept her from dismissing it. "You have one." Brooke gave her the calibration summary, the November date, the Yeager signature, the equipment flag history on the similar unit in Bay 4. She kept it factual, no speculation, no alarm, just the information arranged in the order that made the picture clear. Solis listened. Her expression didn't change. "I'll check the unit myself," Solis said when Brooke finished. "I always run my own check before I go on pump. If there's an issue, I'll flag it directly to Webb, and we'll delay the start." "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Get back to your post before your supervisor notices you're gone." The words were clipped, but not unkind. And don't be in this hallway when Kane comes through. Brooke went back to the post-op bay. She heard Jaeger before she saw him. His voice carried the way the voices of people who believed they were always right carried, loud enough to be authoritative, just controlled enough to avoid the specific word yelling. She came around the corner from the supply corridor and found him standing in the middle of the hallway outside the pre-op staging area, shoulders squared, talking to a resident she didn't know. Made a complaint to surgical staff during a pre-operative protocol window, Jaeger was saying. That's a security-adjacent disruption under the facility code. I'm sorry, I don't, the resident was saying. Do you know where Halstead is right now? Brooke stepped into the hallway. Right here. Jaeger turned. His face did something controlled. The expression of a man who'd been hoping to handle this without an audience and was now recalculating. 3 nurses were at the station 20 feet away. 2 of them looked up. You approached a member of the surgical team during pre-op protocol, he said. I had a patient safety concern. You were told to address concerns through the proper channels. I spoke to the on-call perfusionist. She's independent contract. I didn't violate any protocol. Jaeger took 2 steps toward her, close enough that the dynamic was clear to anyone watching. I've been patient with you, Halstead. I've given you the benefit of the doubt because you're new. That's done. His voice had dropped. You have a pattern of disrupting surgical operations, ignoring direct instructions from facility security, and inserting yourself into situations above your pay grade. You're done on this floor for the day. Go home. She looked at him. I'm on shift until 7. I'm suspending your floor access pending review. Give me your badge. You don't have the authority to badge now. The hallway had gone very quiet. The nurses at the station were very still. Brooke looked at them, at Tara, who had appeared from somewhere to her left and was watching with the face of someone who had seen this before and knew exactly how it ended and hated knowing it. She looked back at Jaeger. She unclipped her badge and held it out. He took it with the particular satisfaction of a man who had just proven something. Security will escort you to your vehicle. You can expect a formal review notice by Monday. I want the suspension documented with the reasons stated. It'll be documented. In writing, with the specific cause and your name and title as the issuing authority. Something flickered behind his eyes, not quite uncertainty, but the ghost of it. It'll be documented, he said again. Now move. The security escort was a young officer named Daniels who looked deeply uncomfortable with the situation and said nothing the entire walk to the parking structure. Brooke said nothing either. She walked at her own pace. She didn't look back. She got into her car, set her hands on the steering wheel, and sat for a moment in the specific silence of someone who is deciding something. Then she took out her phone. The call took 4 minutes. She didn't explain everything. There wasn't time, and the person on the other end didn't need everything. They needed the calibration date, the vendor change, the signature discrepancy, and the name of the patient currently prepped for surgery on OR2. There was a pause on the other end when she said the name. How long until first incision? The voice said. 40 minutes, maybe less. Another pause. We'll make some calls. Brooke sat in her car in the parking structure of Callaway Regional Medical Center and waited. The overcast sky had dropped lower and the light was flat and gray, and the wind was picking up in the way that meant rain by afternoon. At 10:08 a.m., she saw the first black SUV turn into the hospital access road. Then a second. She got out of her car. She was halfway back to the entrance when her phone buzzed. Not a call, a text. 3 words from a number she recognized. They're asking for you. She didn't slow down. She pushed through the hospital entrance doors at a walk, past the security desk where a different officer looked up with confusion because her badge had been suspended and she shouldn't have been able to walk back in. And then she was in the elevator and the elevator was moving and the floor indicator ticked past 1, past 2. The alarm was already going when she reached 3. Not a fire alarm, a code alarm. The specific sustained frequency that meant a critical patient in active deterioration. OR2. She was running before the doors finished opening. Jaeger was in the corridor outside OR2 with 2 of his officers, and the look on his face when he saw her coming was the look of a man who had expected this situation to be resolved and was discovering it wasn't. He moved to block her. You're suspended. The governor is crashing, she said, not stopping. You don't have... Get out of my way, Jaeger. He put a hand on her arm, hard. The grip of someone who was used to physical authority translating into compliance. What happened next took approximately 1.5 seconds. Brooke turned into the grip rather than away from it, rotated her forearm in a way that broke the hold without breaking anything attached to him, stepped past him, and kept walking. It wasn't a scene. It was a transition. Behind her, she heard Jaeger say something to his officers. She didn't hear the words. She was already at the OR door. Through the window, she could see the inside of OR 2. The governor was on the table. Every monitor in the room was flashing. Kane was standing 3 feet back from the patient with his hands raised, not in control, not in authority, but in the frozen posture of a man who had run out of responses. Webb was at the head of the table barking instructions at the anesthesia tech, who was moving, but not fast enough. Solis was at her perfusion console doing something with focused precision, but she was one person, and the room needed more. The hemodynamic monitor at the head of the table was black, not malfunctioning, off, completely dark. Power cycling, complete loss. And in the corner of the OR, standing against the wall with her arms crossed and her eyes on the door, Diane Solis looked up and met Brooke's gaze through the window. Brooke pushed the door open. "She can't be in here!" Kane's voice, sharp and high, stripped of the careful authority. From the far end of the corridor behind her, she heard a voice she didn't recognize, commanding, measured, the specific baritone of someone who gave orders in places where the cost of ignoring them was immediate and significant. "Dr. Kane." She turned. 3 people in dark jackets were moving up the hallway, not hospital staff, not Jaeger's team. The jackets had insignia she recognized on reflex. The kind of insignia that, in her previous life, had meant a situation had just changed in a fundamental way. The man in front was tall, late 40s, with the contained physicality of someone who ran every morning and had never entirely stopped thinking like a soldier. He looked past Kane. He looked past Jaeger. He looked at Brooke. "Halstead," he said. Her name. Just her name. And in the way he said it was everything, the history, the other rooms in other places, the times this exact exchange had happened in conditions that made this hospital corridor look like a comfortable afternoon. "Sir," she said. He looked at the OR door, at the monitors, at Kane, who had gone very still. "We're going to need you inside," he said. He didn't wait for Kane to respond. The man, Colonel Dale Merritt, though she didn't say his name and he didn't offer it, not here, not yet, moved to the OR door with the 2 people flanking him and pushed it open without breaking stride. The decision had already been made. It had been made the moment he'd gotten Brooke's call and recognized the patient's name and understood the geometry of the situation. Now he was executing. Brooke followed him in. The room was louder than it looked through the window. The remaining alarms hadn't been silenced. Someone had started to and then stopped, which meant the silence or not decision had become one more thing the room was waiting on a leader to make. Webb was still at the head of the table, managing airway and watching the anesthesia monitors with the focused desperation of a man holding something together by compression, force alone. Solis was running bypass manually off her secondary display, which was functioning, which was the one piece of luck in the room. 3 other staff members, a scrub tech, a circulating nurse, and Kane's resident Selvin, were stationed at various positions with the careful stillness of people who had realized that moving without direction was going to make things worse. Kane had turned from the door. He was now standing in the middle of the room with his arms crossed and the specific defensive posture of someone who was furious and frightened in exactly equal measure. "This is my operating room," he said. Merritt looked at him. Just looked. The way a man looks at something he's already assessed and found to be a manageable obstacle. "Dr. Kane, I have federal medical authorization to intervene in any active critical situation involving a protected federal subject. The governor qualifies. Step back." "She's a staff nurse. She was suspended from this floor 20 minutes ago." "Step back," Merritt said again. Same tone. No escalation, just repetition, with the specific quality of a statement that would only be made one more time. Kane stepped back. It wasn't graceful. His jaw was tight and his hands had dropped to his sides, and he was doing the calculation that powerful men do when they encounter a force they can't override, the math of which battle to lose now in order to fight something different later. He stepped back, and he watched. Brooke was already at the table. The governor was 61, stockier in person than in photographs, currently gray in the face and breathing in the shallow, irregular pattern that meant his system was working very hard to maintain basic function. The intraoperative monitors that were still running showed what she expected. Blood pressure dropping in a curve that had passed manageable 30 seconds ago, cardiac output flagging, the hemodynamic readouts from the backup display showing a picture that was not yet catastrophic, but was heading there with commitment. The primary monitor was dead. Whatever had caused the power cycle in this unit had done it during the most critical window possible. She looked at Solis across the table. "Secondary bypass stable?" Brooke asked. "Flow is adequate. I'm running conservative." Solis's voice was flat and professional. "I lost the arterial pressure waveform when the main unit went down. I'm estimating off central venous." "How long have you been estimating?" 7 minutes. 7 minutes was a long time to be estimating arterial pressure on an open cardiac patient. Brooke looked at the backup monitoring cart against the far wall. Different manufacturer, older model, but intact. "Selvin," she said. The resident looked up from her position near the instrument table, startled to be addressed by name. "Bring that backup cart over here and connect the arterial line. Port's already established, just needs a functional transducer." Selvin hesitated for a half second, looked at Kane, then made the call. She moved. Brooke turned to Webb. "Anesthesia depth? I've been compensating, but his pressure drop is making me nervous about—" "Keep him where you have him. Don't lighten until I tell you." She put her hands on the table. Not touching the patient yet, just orienting, reading the physical reality in front of her the way she'd learned to read it in conditions that made this room look manageable. Overhead lighting, stable airway, perfusionist on bypass, resident competent enough to follow instruction. She had worse. She'd worked with significantly worse. "I need an updated blood gas," she said to the circulating nurse. "Running it now," the nurse said, already moving. "Suction on standby, Kismet, not running. I need the field quieter." The suction noise cut off. The room dropped a register, and in that drop she could hear the things that mattered. The rhythm from Solis's bypass console, Webb's controlled breathing at the head of the table, the soft mechanical click of Selvin connecting the transducer lead to the arterial line port. Merritt was standing against the wall. He'd brought the two people with him inside. One was a military physician, a compact woman with short red hair, who Brooke recognized as Dr. Anya Rourke, a trauma anesthesiologist she'd worked alongside during her second deployment. The other was a man she didn't know, holding a case that contained equipment she recognized by shape. "Rourke," Brooke said, without looking up. "Already here," Rourke said, and moved to stand beside Webb. The blood gas came back in 4 minutes. Brooke read it. Acidosis, moderate, not yet severe, correctable. "Bicarb measured," she said to the anesthesia tech. Told him the dose. The tech looked at Webb, who nodded. It went in. "Arterial lines reading," Selvin said. Her voice was slightly unsteady. Not collapse, just the tremor of a young physician running hotter than normal. But her hands were precise. The transducer was connected. The backup monitor flickered to life and showed the arterial waveform, jagged and low, but present and real. Brooke looked at the number. Lower than she wanted, not yet where she couldn't work. "Good," she said. "Stay on it. Tell me if it drops another 10. Selvin nodded. "Dr. Kane." She didn't look at him when she said it. "The original valve repair, where were you in the procedure when the monitor went down?" A pause. The question was direct and technical, and it required him to engage with her as a clinical peer or not answer, and he was doing the exact calculation she expected. Then, "We'd completed the aortotomy, pre-bypass valve inspection." "Before leaflet work?" "Before leaflet work." "Good." That was something. They hadn't gotten to the delicate part. The field was open but not yet complicated by the repair itself. "The plan was a replacement or repair?" "Repair. Posterior leaflet prolapse." She put on gloves that the scrub tech held out. The tech, she noted, was ahead of the request, had seen where this was going and was already thinking 2 steps forward. Good. Kane said, "You can't perform surgery. You're a nurse." She looked up at him for the first time since she'd come in. His face was doing something complicated. Not pure hostility now, but a mixture of it, with fear underneath and something else she recognized. The specific humiliation of a man who was watching someone else manage the situation he had failed to manage. "I'm not performing surgery," she said. "I'm managing your patient until his physiology is stable enough to complete the procedure. When he's stable, you're going to finish the repair, unless you'd prefer to explain to the federal officers in this room why you'd rather not." He said nothing. She turned back to the table. The next 43 minutes were not clean. She'd have been suspicious if they were. The governor's pressure stabilized enough in the first 15 minutes that Rourke and Webb were able to transition to a coordinated anesthesia protocol that gave Solis better bypass parameters to work with. The acidosis corrected. Not completely. There were 2 moments where Brooke saw numbers she didn't love, and one point where Selvin's voice went sharp with "it's dropping," and Brooke said, "I see it, hold," and adjusted the fluid rate and watched the waveform climb back to where she needed it, with the slow reliability of a process that was going to work. Not because it was certain, but because the margins were still there if you didn't panic into them. Kane watched the whole thing from the side of the room. She was aware of him, his position, his silence, the way it had shifted from hostile to something she could only describe as assessing. She didn't address him again unless it was necessary. When it was necessary, when she needed information about the pre-bypass inspection findings, when she needed the scrub tech's attention redirected, she was direct and impersonal. This wasn't about him. It never had been. At minute 22, Merritt crossed the room and stood near her. "We have investigators outside, Madse," he said, quietly enough that it didn't carry past her. "How many?" 3 federal, 2 state. They want the equipment. All of it. The failed monitor, the maintenance logs, the vendor contracts. They should talk to Tara Osei on the floor. She filed a written concern in October, and there's a calibration log with Yeager's signature that doesn't belong there. "We have the logs." She glanced at him. "Already?" "We've been watching this facility for 6 weeks. His voice was very level. "Your call this morning was the catalyst, not the start." She absorbed that. 6 weeks. Which meant someone else had been seeing the same picture she'd seen in 4 days, and had been building something around it carefully enough that they weren't going to walk away empty-handed. "Yeager's in the building," she said. "I know. He's going to make this harder than it needs to be. He already tried. He's currently in the administrative wing having a conversation with 2 people from the State Inspector General's office." A pause. "He doesn't know yet that they're from the IG's office. He thinks they're from hospital administration." She almost said something. Didn't. Went back to the monitor. The waveform was holding. At minute 38, she looked across the table at Kane. "He's stable enough," she said. "You can finish the repair." Kane met her eyes. There was a long beat. Long enough that she thought he might push back, might find some version of refusal that let him reclaim something. Then he moved to the table, and his hands found the instruments with the automatic precision of 20 years of surgical practice, and she watched him work. He was good. She'd known he would be. Arrogance and competence weren't mutually exclusive. She'd met enough brilliant surgeons to understand that. His hands were steady and his technique was clean, and the posterior leaflet work he did over the next 19 minutes was exactly what the patient needed. Whatever else Kane was, whatever the investigators outside were going to find when they pulled the contracts and the logs and the signatures, he was a skilled surgeon, and the governor was going to live because of it. She wasn't going to pretend otherwise. When the final sutures went in, and Webb began the controlled emergence from anesthesia, and Solis started weaning bypass with the careful incremental steps of a woman who had done this 1,000 times, Brooke stepped back from the table. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was even. She was aware suddenly of how tired she was. Not physically, or not only that, but the specific depletion that came after the kind of sustained focus where you couldn't afford to let anything slip, where every decision had a cost, and you were the one calculating it. Selvin was standing nearby. The resident looked at her with an expression Brooke couldn't quite read, something between gratitude and disorientation, the face of a young physician who had just watched a situation turn inside out and was still processing where the new reality had landed. "Thank you," Selvin said quietly. Brooke looked at her. "You connected that transducer in under 90 seconds with a line that wasn't yours. Good work." Selvin blinked, like she hadn't expected to be assessed in that direction. Brooke pulled off her gloves and walked to the door. The hallway outside OR2 had become a different place. Yeager was gone. His two officers were still at their posts, but they had the uncertain posture of people waiting for a directive that hadn't come. Their anchor had been removed, and they hadn't yet received new instructions, which meant they were standing in the corridor trying to look purposeful and mostly succeeding. 3 people she didn't recognize were moving between the nursing station and the administrative corridor. Not hospital staff, not Merritt's people. They had the particular brisk efficiency of investigators who had already made their minds up about what they were looking for and were now in the phase of confirming it. One of them was photographing the equipment log that Philip had been maintaining, the paper copy, physical, the kind that couldn't be altered without leaving traces. Philip was standing at the station watching this with the expression of a man who had seen this coming and was simultaneously relieved and terrified about it. Brooke stopped next to him. "You okay?" she said. He exhaled slowly. "I filed a secondary report in November, after Tara's October complaint. I didn't tell anyone here." "Who did you file it with?" "State Health Oversight Board. Anonymous tip line." He looked at the investigators. Didn't know if it went anywhere. She looked at him. 6 days, and she'd read him as someone running conflict avoidance calculations constantly. Someone who understood the problems and was choosing the least damaging path. She hadn't been wrong, but she'd been incomplete. He'd found a way to do something. "It went somewhere," she said. He made a sound that might have been a laugh under different circumstances. Tara appeared from the direction of the nursing lounge, moving fast, and stopped when she saw Brooke standing in the hallway with a badge that was technically still suspended. She looked at the investigators. She looked at the officers standing without purpose. She looked at Brooke. "Is he—" she started. "Stable. Kane finished the repair. He's in emergence." Tara put one hand flat on the nursing station counter and held it there for a moment, like she needed the surface. "Okay," she said. "Okay." Then she looked at the far end of the corridor, where a door was opening. Merritt came through it. Behind him, with the expression of a man who had just finished a conversation he hadn't known he was walking into, was Brent Yeager. 2 people flanked him. Not Merritt's people. Different jackets. Yeager's face was a particular shade of control that was doing a lot of work to contain what was underneath. He saw Brooke. The distance between them was about 30 feet of hospital corridor. He stopped walking. The people flanking him didn't stop. They adjusted, maintaining their position, which told her everything about what kind of flanking this was. She watched him understand it. It happened in stages. The information arriving, the implications following, the particular reorganization of a man who had spent years being the most powerful person in a room, recalibrating in real time that he was not, in fact, the most powerful person in this one. "Halstead," he said. Flat. Almost nothing in it. She didn't say anything back. There wasn't anything that needed saying. One of the people beside him said something quietly. He turned his head, turned back. And in the turn back, something in his face had closed down in the way that faces close down when a man has just been told something official and final. He was walked, not roughly, not dramatically, just walked toward the administrative wing. Brooke watched him go. She found an empty family consultation room off the main corridor and sat down in one of the upholstered chairs and stared at the wall for about 4 minutes. The wall had a generic landscape print on it. Mountains, water, completely inoffensive. She looked at it without seeing it. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She picked up. "This is Deputy Director Carla Vance, State Health Oversight." The voice was businesslike and unhurried. "I understand you're the individual who raised the calibration concern this morning." "I did. We've been working a parallel investigation into Callaway Regional's equipment procurement process for approximately 2 months. Your call this morning and your contact's escalation moved our timeline up considerably. I'm glad it was useful. It was more than useful. A pause. I want to be direct with you, Ms. Halstead. We have evidence suggesting the equipment deficiencies at this facility were not accidental. The vendor contract changes, the falsified calibration logs, the suppression of staff complaints. We're looking at a coordinated pattern that's going to take time to fully document. I understand. In the meantime, I want you to know that your suspension this morning has no legal validity. Your access to this facility is fully restored under our investigative authority. You should be aware that the individuals who suspended you may be subjects of investigation. I had already assumed that. Another pause, shorter. You're very calm about this. Brooke looked at the mountain print. I've had a busy morning. There was a sound on the other end that might have been the beginning of a laugh before it was recalled to professionalism. I expect we'll need a formal statement from you before the end of the day. I'll be available. She ended the call. Sat for another 30 seconds. Then she got up, went to the hallway water fountain that was barely functional but technically running, drank from it, and went back to the floor. The surgical floor at 1:30 p.m. was a changed place. It had the specific quality of aftermath. Not the aftermath of disaster, but the aftermath of revelation. The staff who'd been on shift all morning were moving through their routines with the careful deliberateness of people who understood that everything had shifted and weren't yet sure how to carry that shift in their bodies. Word traveled fast in hospital corridors. Most of them knew by now that Yeager had been walked to administrative. Most of them had seen the investigators. The ones who'd been at the nurse's station when Yeager suspended Brooke that morning, who'd watched him take her badge, who'd held very still and said nothing, were now carrying that differently than they had 3 hours ago. Tara found her at the station, filling in patient notes with a borrowed badge clipped to her scrubs. Kane is asking to speak to you, Tara said. Brooke kept writing. Where? His office. He called down to the station. She finished the note, capped the pen. Did he say what about? No? Tara's expression said, but I can guess. The walk to Kane's office took her past the administrative corridor, where she could see through the glass partition that the consultation that had been underway was still underway, with additional people now present. She didn't stop. She went to Kane's office, knocked, and entered when he said to come in. He was sitting behind his desk. He'd changed out of scrubs into his regular clothes, which meant he'd had time and the presence of mind to do that, which meant he was thinking about the frame of this conversation before it happened. He looked older than he had in the OR. The stripping away of the surgical environment removed a layer of professional context he apparently leaned on more than she'd realized. Sit down, he said. I'm fine standing. A beat. He accepted this. The governor is in recovery. ICU transfer in approximately 2 hours if his pressure holds. Good. You stabilized him. He said it plainly, not generously, plainly as if he were reporting a clinical fact. In a situation that I had, he stopped, restarted. I was not handling effectively. She waited. This was not an apology. She wasn't expecting one. I want to understand what you saw, he said. The calibration issue, the monitor. You flagged it twice before the procedure. I flagged it to Philip at the nurse's station Thursday morning, flagged it to you the same day, flagged the specific OR2 unit to Solus this morning, and you saw the sign-off discrepancy. Yeager's signature on a biomedical calibration log. Yes. Kane's jaw moved. He looked at his desk, then back at her. I didn't sign the approval. I know. The signature was Yeager's. I signed the procurement recommendation for the new vendor in February of last year. His voice had gone careful. Not confessional, not covering, just careful, the voice of a man navigating language that might later be repeated in formal contexts. I was told the vendor had passed all necessary certifications. Who told you that? He looked at her directly. Yeager. She held his gaze. In the silence, the thing he wasn't saying was perfectly clear. He had signed a document, and he had trusted an assurance that he should have verified, and somewhere in the distance between those two facts was the governor lying in a recovery bay and a federal investigation unfolding in the administrative wing, and a lot of questions about where Victor Kane's responsibility began and ended. She wasn't going to sort that out for him. That was for other people. "Is there anything else?" she said. He seemed to deflate slightly. Not collapse, just the release of a held position. "No," he said. "Thank you." She left. At 2:15, one of Merritt's people found her at the nurse's station and handed her a document. A single sheet, official letterhead she recognized as Federal Medical Oversight Authority, with her name on it and 2 lines of text and a signature at the bottom. She read it once, folded it, put it in her scrub's pocket. Tara was watching from 2 feet away. "What is it?" "They want me in a formal debrief at 4. "Is that all it says?" Brooke put her hand over the pocket. "No," she said, "but the rest can wait." Tara looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at the nursing station. The charts, the monitors, the ordinary machinery of a hospital floor doing its work. "The 3 o'clock admits are coming in," she said. "You want to take the first 2? "Yeah," Brooke said. "I'll take them." She picked up the first chart. The patient was a 48-year-old woman with post-operative complications following a procedure from the previous week. Elevated temperature, localized pain, a clinical picture that needed someone to look at it carefully and not assume. She started reading. The floor moved around her. Nurses crossed the station. A resident made a phone call in the hallway. Somewhere behind her, a monitor beeped and was acknowledged and went quiet. The afternoon went on. At 3:47, Philip appeared at her elbow with the look he'd had all day. The specific expression of someone trying to hold several pieces of information at once and not quite managing. "Investigator outside wants to see you," he said. "Before the 4 o'clock debrief." She set down the chart. "Which investigator?" "The one from the IG's office." He paused. "There are 2 more who just arrived. Different agency." She looked at him. "Which agency?" He handed her a card. She read the name and the header above it, and something settled in her chest. The specific feeling of a puzzle piece going in, not with the satisfying click of completion, but with the recognition that the picture being assembled was considerably larger than she'd initially understood. "Okay," she said. She followed him out. The investigator was standing in the corridor near the elevator bank. A woman in her 50s, dark suit, the contained energy of someone who had driven a long distance on short notice and hadn't stopped to recalibrate. She extended a hand when she saw Brooke coming. "Ms. Halstead, I'm Special Agent Dana Frost." The handshake was firm and brief. "We need to talk about Brent Yeager and a series of equipment contracts that go back considerably further than this facility." Brooke stopped walking. "How much further?" Frost met her eyes. 3 other hospitals. 4 states? The same vendor, the same sign-off pattern, the same suppression of staff complaints. Oh, a pause. "Callaway Regional is not where this started, Ms. Halstead. It's where it almost ended. For the governor. We have reason to believe at least 2 deaths at other facilities may be connected to the same defective equipment approval chain." The elevator behind them dinged. Neither of them moved. "We're going to need everything you have," Frost said. "Every observation, every date, every conversation, starting from your first day." She paused. "And we're going to need it now because Yeager's lawyer arrived 40 minutes ago and we're on a clock." Brooke looked at her. "Yeager retained counsel in under 2 hours, she said. "He did." "Which means he made a call before your people got to him." Frost's expression didn't change. "It does." "Who did he call?" There was a pause that lasted exactly long enough to tell Brooke that Frost knew the answer and was deciding how much of it to share in a hospital corridor at 3:47 in the afternoon. "That," Frost said, "is the part we don't have yet." The debrief room was a converted family consultation space on the 2nd floor. The same generic landscape prints, the same upholstered chairs, now pushed to the walls to make room for a folding table, and 4 people who had driven or flown in on short notice and were running on coffee and urgency. Frost sat across from Brooke. To her left was a man from the state IG's office named Raymond Cho, who had a legal pad and wrote everything down in handwriting so small it looked like code. To Frost's right was a woman Brooke didn't know who was introduced only as federal oversight and said almost nothing for the first 20 minutes. Merritt sat in the corner, not at the table, in the corner, arms crossed, watching. Start from the beginning, Frost said. First day. Everything you noticed. Brooke started from the beginning. She was precise about it. Dates, times, specific observations, the calibration tags, the amber warning lights on the IV pumps, the badge access log that hadn't been updated, the equipment cart she'd seen in the corridor. She described Yeager's briefing, Kane's dismissal at the nurse's station, Philip's response to her concern about Bay 4. She described what she'd seen on the calibration log and what it meant that a security officer had signed off on a biomedical document. Cho wrote constantly. The federal oversight woman typed on a laptop she'd opened at some point without Brooke noticing. Frost asked clarifying questions that were short and well-targeted, the questions of someone who already understood the shape of what she was hearing and was filling specific gaps. It took 40 minutes. When Brooke finished, the room was quiet for a moment. The vendor, Frost said, Meridian Biomedical Solutions. You noticed the manufacturer marking on the OR2 unit. Same as the Bay 4 unit. Different model, same manufacturer, same service sticker format. Meridian was awarded the Callaway Regional Supply Contract 11 months ago. Previous vendor, a company called Hartfield Medical, was dropped after 2 of their units were flagged for decommission. Frost set a photograph on the table. It showed a document, a contract recommendation page. This signature is Yeager's. This one is Kane's. She pointed to 2 lines on the document. Kane signed the physician endorsement. Yeager signed the facility security and compliance certification. Brooke looked at the document. Kane said he was told the vendor had passed certifications. That Yeager told him. Kane is saying a lot of things right now. Frost's voice was neutral. What he signed is what we can use. Is he cooperating? Actively. Frost picked the photograph back up, which is useful but also complicated because the story he's telling and the story Yeager is telling are very different, and both of them are leaving things out in ways that are convenient for themselves. What's Yeager's version? Frost looked at her steadily. Yeager's version is that he processed vendor certifications in good faith, that any documentation irregularities were clerical, and that his removal of you from the surgical floor this morning was a routine security measure based on your pattern of disruptive behavior. Brooke said nothing. He's also claiming, Frost continued, that the governor's surgical complications were the result of physician error, not equipment failure, and that any investigation into equipment procurement is a misdirection. She paused. His attorney is very good. He's been in contact with Yeager for approximately 18 months, not as his lawyer, as something else. What's something else? Frost glanced at the federal oversight woman, who looked up from her laptop for the first time. That's what we're working on, the woman said. Mr. Yeager has a contact at Meridian Biomedical who has been routing communication through a third party. We've identified the routing. We haven't fully mapped the relationship yet. Brooke looked at Merritt. He was watching her with the contained attention he'd had all day. Not signaling, not guiding, just present. She looked back at Frost. The 2 deaths you mentioned, at other facilities. A patient in Dunmore General, 8 months ago. Intraoperative cardiac arrest attributed to anesthesia complications. A second patient at Vantage Memorial in Westfield 5 months ago, attributed to pre-existing condition deterioration. Frost's voice was level and dry in the way that voices go dry when the information in them is too heavy for inflection. Both facilities had recently switched to Meridian equipment. Both had complaints from nursing staff that were suppressed before the complications occurred. Brooke looked at the table surface, thought about the amber lights on the IV pumps, the calibration tags, the specific ordinary-looking evidence that a system was failing that nobody with power had looked at hard enough or long enough to act on. 2 people. Philip filed an anonymous tip in November, she said. We received it. It was one of several factors that moved this from a preliminary inquiry to an active investigation. Frost looked at her. Your call this morning was the last piece. We'd been waiting for a direct inside account from a credible witness with clinical standing. Cho looked up from his legal pad. He'd been writing the whole time. Ms. Halstead, the document Colonel Merritt's office gave you earlier, the authorization letter. She put her hand over her scrub's pocket. That formalizes your status as a protected federal witness and a clinical consultant to this investigation for the duration. He looked at his pad. It also restores your employment status here pending a formal review that, given what we're looking at, is largely a formality. Frost said, "We need you on this floor, not in a debrief room." She went back upstairs at 5:20. The floor had turned over. Day shift transitioning to evening, the particular loosening that came at shift change when the accumulated tension of the day met the incoming energy of people who hadn't been there for it yet. Tara was still on. She'd stayed past her shift, which Brooke had expected, and was briefing the evening charge nurse at the station with the compressed efficiency of someone trying to transfer 12 hours of context in 6 minutes. She stopped when she saw Brooke coming. "Governor's been moved to the cardiac ICU," Tara said. "Pressure's been holding since transfer. Webb checked in an hour ago." "Good. Kane's in his office. He hasn't left." She paused. "2 of the investigators went in about 30 minutes ago and haven't come out." Brooke took the chart Tara was holding and looked at the evening handoff notes. 14 patients on the surgical floor, 3 flagged for monitoring, 2 fresh post-ops from afternoon procedures. Ordinary work, the kind of work that ran underneath everything else, regardless of what the administrative wing was doing. "I need to check on the Bay 4 unit," she said. "Investigators already tagged it. It's been removed from service." "The one in the OR2 supply corridor too?" "All of them." Tara's voice was quiet. "They pulled 4 units total, all Meridian." Brooke nodded. She picked up a fresh patient chart and started reading, because the patient still needed reading. She'd been at the station for 20 minutes when Selvon appeared. Still in her white coat, a little wrinkled now, with the look of someone who had been keeping herself busy to avoid standing still long enough to process the day. "Can I—" Selvon started, then stopped. Tried again. "I want to ask you something about the OR today." Brooke looked up. "When you looked at the numbers and said, 'Hold,' when I said it was dropping and you said I see it, 'Hold,' how did you know it was going to come back up?" It was a real question, not admiring, not angling for anything, just a young physician trying to learn something specific from someone who knew it. Brooke considered how to answer honestly. "I didn't know," she said. "I knew we still had margin. The waveform hadn't gone flat. It was dropping, but the morphology was still there. Pulling back the fluid rate was the right call, but it was going to take a few seconds to show, and if you'd panicked into a second intervention in those seconds, you'd have crossed signals." Selvin absorbed this. "You've seen it go that way before." "Several times." "In combat?" "Once in a forward surgical unit in a tent with a generator running on a fuel tank that was probably 2 hours from empty. Different context, same waveform." Selvin was quiet for a moment. Then, "How do you stay that calm?" Brooke looked at the chart in her hands. "I don't," she said. "I stay functional. Those aren't the same thing." Selvin seemed to turn this over. She nodded once, like something had been confirmed rather than revealed, and went back to her work. At 6:40, Raymond Cho came out of Kane's office with his legal pad and walked directly to the nurse's station and stood in front of Brooke with the look of someone who had just gathered something significant and was deciding how much weight to put on it. "Kane gave us names," he said, keeping his voice down. "Yeager's contact at Meridian?" "That, and a second name. Someone at the procurement level of the State Health Facilities Board who was rubber stamping Yeager's certifications without independent verification." He looked at his pad. "It goes higher than this hospital." Brooke set down the chart. "How high?" "High enough that we need to move faster than we planned." He looked at the administrative wing. "Yeager made a second call before his lawyer arrived. We traced it. It was to a number registered to a consulting firm in the capital that we now believe is a front for the procurement contact Kane named. So Yeager warned someone, 40 minutes before federal investigators formally identified themselves. "Yes." Cho's voice was tight. "Which means there's a possibility that someone in the capital is currently deciding what to do with documents they should not have. Shredding them being one option." She looked at him. "What do you need from me?" "Formal sworn statement. Tonight, not tomorrow." "I already said I'd give one." "There's more." He glanced toward Merritt's position down the hall. "We want you present when we confront Yeager with the full scope of what we have. Not as a witness, as a clinical expert. His attorney is going to argue the equipment failures were within acceptable variance for standard hospital operations. We need someone who can counter that argument in real time with technical specificity. That's not a nursing role. No, Cho said. It's a consultant role, which is what you are now, technically. He said it without inflection, just information. She thought about it for 2 seconds. 2 seconds was enough. When? 8 o'clock. Conference room B, administrative wing. She went back to the charts. Conference room B had better furniture than the family consultation rooms. A real table, real chairs, the kind of institutional formality that indicated decisions happened here. At 8 o'clock, it held 7 people. Frost, Cho, the federal oversight woman whose name turned out to be Special Agent Lena Marsh, 2 additional IG investigators. Brooke hadn't met before, Yeager and Yeager's attorney. The attorney's name was Preston Vale. He was in his late 50s, silver-haired in a different way than Kane, cultivated rather than natural, the silver of someone who had decided it was an asset. He had a leather briefcase that looked expensive and a way of arranging himself in a chair that said he had been in rooms like this many times and had usually walked out of them with what he'd come for. Yeager looked different than he had in the hallway that morning. The uniform authority was gone. He was in civilian clothes now, a collared shirt, and without the badge and the keyring and the security posture, he was a heavy-set man in his mid-40s who was doing a great deal of work to project a confidence that had taken a significant blow. He looked at Brooke when she came in. She took the seat Cho indicated across the table from him and opened the notepad she'd brought and didn't look back. Vale opened with procedural objections that took 4 minutes and accomplished nothing. Frost waited them out with the patience of someone who had allocated the 4 minutes already and wasn't surprised by any of them. When Vale finished, she laid a document on the table. Mr. Yeager, this is the calibration certification log for the OR2 hemodynamic monitoring unit at Callaway Regional. Your signature appears as the certifying authority. As I've stated, Vale said, my client processed vendor documentation in good faith. This is not a vendor document, Frost said. This is an internal biomedical compliance record. The authority to sign this document requires specific certification under state health code. Mr. Yeager does not hold that certification. He never has. She set a second document beside the first. This is his complete certification record. Biomedical authority is not on it. Vale looked at the documents. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture made a small, careful adjustment. The question, Frost continued, is whether Mr. Yeager signed this document on his own initiative or at the instruction of another party. My client will not be answering, because the answer matters significantly to whether we're discussing fraud or conspiracy. Frost let that land. And it matters to who else we're talking to tonight. Yeager looked at his attorney. Vale put one hand flat on the table, a signal that meant stop talking, and then said evenly, my client has already provided a full account of his actions. We are not aware of any evidence that contradicts that account. Marsh set her laptop on the table and turned it so the screen faced Yeager. Mr. Yeager, do you recognize this communication thread? Yeager looked at the screen. Nothing in his face moved. Brooke looked at the screen. It was an email chain. Dates, addresses partially redacted, but the content visible. 14 months of correspondence. She didn't read it all, but she read enough. The word meridian appeared 7 times in the visible portion. The word cleared appeared 4 times. A number, 6 figures, appeared twice, in contexts that had nothing to do with hospital budgets. The routing account, Marsh said, is registered to a consulting firm you're already familiar with. The receiving account traces to a personal account we've had under observation for 6 weeks. She paused. This isn't everything we have. This is what we're showing you now. Vale was very still. Yeager said for the first time since Brooke had sat down, I want to speak with my attorney, privately. You have 5 minutes, Frost said. After that, the window on cooperation closes, and the full file goes to the prosecutor as is. She stood. The investigators stood. Brooke stood. They went into the corridor and the door closed behind them. Frost and Marsh exchanged a look that communicated something Brooke didn't have context for. Cho was writing on his pad. The other 2 investigators were on their phones. Brooke stood at the corridor window and looked out at the parking structure. The media van from this morning was gone. The lot was mostly empty at this hour. The overcast had cleared, and there were a few stars visible past the edge of the building, which she noticed and then stopped noticing. 4 minutes and 40 seconds later, the conference room door opened. Vale stood in the doorway. His expression had reorganized itself into something professional and unreadable. "My client is prepared to cooperate," he said, "in exchange for appropriate consideration." Frost didn't smile. "What's he giving us?" "The full transaction record, the complete correspondence, the name of the individual at the State Facilities Board." Vale paused. "And a second name. An individual who approached him initially, who proposed the arrangement and structured the vendor contract process from outside the facility." Everyone in the corridor went still. "A second name," Frost repeated. "Someone with significant institutional standing," Vale said. "Someone who will argue very loudly that my client is fabricating this, which is why my client needs protection before he says it out loud." Brooke looked at Frost. Frost was looking at Vale with the focused attention of someone who was doing rapid calculation about what they were about to receive and whether it was going to hold. "Who is it?" Frost said. Vale looked at his briefcase, opened it, took out a single sheet of paper and held it out. Frost took it, read it. Her expression didn't change, but her hand, holding the paper, went very still. Cho moved to look over her shoulder and read it. His pen stopped moving for the first time since the debrief started. Marsh read it last. She closed her laptop. Brooke watched all of this and didn't ask. She would be told what she needed to know. That was how these things worked. Information distributed on the basis of operational necessity, not personal curiosity. But then Frost looked up and looked directly at her. "Ms. Halstead," she said, "the governor is going to need to know about this tonight." Brooke looked at her. "Why tonight?" "Because the person on this paper," Frost said, "has a meeting with the governor's chief of staff scheduled for tomorrow morning, a meeting about the investigation." The corridor was very quiet. "They're already inside the response," Brooke said. "Yes." She looked at the paper in Frost's hand. She couldn't read it from where she was standing. The angle was wrong, the light was bad, and Frost hadn't extended it toward her. "Is it someone I know?" she said. Frost's answer was not immediate, which was its own kind of answer. "Not directly," Frost said, "but you've spoken to them today." The name on the paper was Gerald Ferris. Brooke understood it the moment Frost confirmed she'd spoken to him today. The nursing supervisor who had told her the process was followed and suggested she get back to her post-op assignments. The man who had shut down her concern about the OR2 unit with the specific efficiency of someone who had practiced shutting down concerns. She'd read him as bureaucratic deflection. She'd been right about the deflection. She'd been wrong about the source of it. Ferris wasn't protecting the institution. He was protecting the arrangement. "He was the internal coordinator," Frost said, when they were back in the corridor with the conference room door closed behind Vale and Yeager. "Not the initiator. Yeager brought him in 18 months ago. But Ferris controlled the complaint routing. Staff concerns about equipment went to him first. He determined which ones got escalated and which ones got buried." "Tara's October complaint," Brooke said, "went to Ferris, never left his desk." Frost's voice was even. "Philip's November tip went through the anonymous state line, which is why it survived. Anything that went through internal channels, Ferris killed it." "He knew about the deaths at the other facilities?" Frost looked at her directly. "We don't know yet how much he knew. What we know is that he was paid to suppress. What he suppressed and what the downstream consequences were. That's what the expanded investigation is going to determine." She paused. "What we know right now is that he has a meeting tomorrow morning with the governor's chief of staff, a briefing on operational continuity during the investigation. He asked for it. The chief of staff doesn't know what Ferris is. He's going to try to shape the narrative before we can." "Yes, which is why we need to move tonight." Frost looked at Merritt, who had been standing at the end of the corridor through this exchange. "Colonel, the governor." Merritt straightened. "He's awake." Webb cleared a brief contact at 9. Frost checked her watch. It was 8:31. "We have 30 minutes. Halstead, I need you with us." "Why me specifically?" "Because the governor is going to ask about the nurse who stabilized him. Webb already told him there was a clinical intervention that changed the outcome. The governor asked to meet whoever it was. Frost said it plainly, without flourish. You being present when we brief him isn't sentiment. It establishes your credibility as a witness before Ferris has any opportunity to characterize you otherwise. Brooke thought about this for 2 seconds. She thought about Ferris and the way he'd looked at her over his desk. The patience of a man who was certain the institutional machinery would absorb her concern and return to normal. She thought about Tara's written complaint sitting in a desk drawer for 4 months. "Let's go," she said. The cardiac ICU at Callaway Regional was on the 4th floor, separated from the surgical wing by 2 elevator banks and a security checkpoint that had, in the last 6 hours, been upgraded from a single hospital officer to a 4-person detail that included 2 of Merritt's people. The governor's room was at the end of the unit, curtains drawn, the sounds of monitoring equipment audible through the closed door as a soft, steady rhythm. Webb met them in the hallway. He looked exhausted in the way that anesthesiologists looked exhausted after a complicated case. Not physically depleted, but mentally wrung out. The specific tiredness of someone who had spent 8 hours managing the gap between what was happening and what could go wrong. "He's lucid," Webb said. "Pressure's been stable since transfer. He knows the surgery had complications. I told him there was an intraoperative equipment failure and that additional personnel intervened. I didn't give him specifics." "He's going to get specifics now," Frost said. Webb looked at Brooke. Something passed across his face. Not quite an apology, not quite relief. Something in between. "You did good work today," he said, quietly enough that it felt like it was meant for her and not for the record. She nodded once. She wasn't sure what to do with it, so she let it stand. The governor's room was smaller than she'd expected for a high-profile patient. The ICU didn't have a VIP suite, which was either an oversight or a policy decision, and either way, it meant Nathan Kress was in a standard single with monitoring leads on his chest and an arterial line in his left wrist, and the institutional pillow that nobody ever found comfortable. He was 61 years old, and he looked it, more so than in photographs, the surgery and the scare and the hours of recovery having stripped away whatever photogenic presentation he normally maintained. He was sitting up at about 45 degrees when they came in. His eyes were clear. He looked at Brooke first. Not Frost, not Merritt, not the investigators. Brooke. He'd been told someone was coming, and he'd apparently made a decision about who he wanted to see when the door opened. "You're the nurse," he said. His voice was rough from the intubation but carried. "Brooke Halstead." "Yes." He looked at her for a moment with the assessing directness of a man who had spent decades reading people in rooms. Whatever he was looking for, he seemed to find enough of it. "Sit down," he said. Then, to the room in general, "Everyone sit down." There were only 4 chairs. Frost, Merritt, and Marsh took 3. Brooke took the 4th. Cho and the other investigators stood near the door. Frost briefed him. She was efficient about it. 15 minutes, covering the equipment failure, the procurement fraud, Yeager's role, Kane's involvement, the suppression of staff complaints, the 2 deaths at other facilities, and the expanded federal investigation. She gave him the structure without every detail, the way you brief someone who needs to understand the shape of something rather than its granular content. Kress listened without interrupting. His face was controlled, the practiced stillness of a politician who had learned to receive bad information without broadcasting his reaction. But his right hand, resting on the bed rail, tightened twice. Once when Frost mentioned the vendor contract, once when she said 2 deaths. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. "Ferris," Kress said. "Gerald Ferris." "Yes, sir." He briefed my transition team when I came into office. Operational continuity, hospital compliance in the state health network. He said it slowly, working through it. He was on the advisory panel for the Facility Modernization Initiative 18 months ago. Frost's expression didn't change, but Cho was writing very fast. The Modernization Initiative included equipment procurement guidelines, Kress said. He wasn't asking, he was assembling. "I signed the executive authorization for the new vendor certification framework." "You did," Frost said, "based on recommendations from the advisory panel." "Which Ferris was on." "Which Ferris was on." Kress looked at the ceiling for a moment, then he looked at Brooke. You figured this out in 6 days. I noticed equipment concerns. Other people had been trying to raise them for months. But you're the one who made the call that brought in, he gestured toward Merritt, the cavalry. I had the right contact, she said, and I'd been in enough situations where ignoring warning signs had consequences that I couldn't make myself look away. He held her gaze. Where? She told him briefly. 2 deployments, forward surgical units, the particular kind of trauma care that happened in places where the supply chain was unreliable and the equipment was whatever you had, and the margin for error was narrower than anyone in a well-funded hospital had ever dealt with. And you ended up here, he said when she finished, 6 days ago. He made a sound that might have been wry under different circumstances. Good timing, he said, and then, without transition, the meeting with my chief of staff tomorrow. Ferris requested it? Yes, Frost said. At what time? 9 a.m. Kress looked at Merritt. Something passed between them that wasn't a verbal exchange, but had the structure of one. Then he looked at Frost. He doesn't get canceled, he said. He walks into that meeting and finds something different than he's expecting. Frost had clearly already been thinking along these lines. We can have investigators positioned. I want to be there, Kress said. Sir, you're 22 hours post-surgery. I'm aware of what I am. His voice was even. I'm also the governor of this state, and someone used my executive authority to build a fraud that killed 2 people and nearly killed me on an operating table today. I want to be in the room when he walks in. Webb, from the doorway where he'd been standing throughout the briefing, said, Absolutely not, in a tone that did not leave significant room for negotiation. Kress looked at him. Sir, Webb said without softening it, you are not attending any meeting tomorrow morning. Your pressure has been stable for 4 hours. I need it stable for at least 48 more before I consider any activity that involves stress response. And confronting the man who nearly got you killed is, clinically speaking, a stress response. A silence. Fine, Kress said. The word was short and a little tight. But I want a live feed, and I want it documented that this was my directive. Noted, Frost said. Kress looked at Brooke again. You'll be there. It wasn't a question. She looked at Frost, who gave a small nod. I'll be there, Brooke said. Well, she didn't sleep that night. Not meaningfully. She went back to the motel off Route 9 at 11, lay on top of the covers for 3 hours, and was back at the hospital by 5 because there was nothing useful she could do at the motel, and at least at the hospital there were things to move through. The surgical floor at 5 in the morning had the particular quiet of early institutional hours, the overnight staff moving through their routines with the contained efficiency of people who had been doing it long enough that it didn't require daylight. Brooke checked in on the post-op patient she'd been covering, read the overnight notes, found nothing alarming. The floor was functioning. Underneath everything that had happened yesterday, the work had continued in the ordinary way that work continued. Tara wasn't there. She'd finally gone home sometime after 8. But there was a note in Brooke's borrowed station slot, handwritten on a prescription pad sheet. 14 patients. All stable. You did good. T. She folded it and put it with the federal document in her scrubs pocket. At 6:30, Merritt found her in the break room with a cup of coffee that was bad in the institutional way all early morning hospital coffee was bad, and sat across from her without asking if it was a good time. Ferris doesn't know Yeager talked, he said. You're sure? Yeager's attorney is currently under a communication restriction as part of the cooperation agreement. Ferris's last known contact with Yeager was yesterday afternoon before the investigators identified themselves. He wrapped his hands around his own cup. He thinks he's walking into a routine advisory meeting. What's his read on yesterday? The investigation? His official position, he sent a statement to hospital administration at 7 last night, is that the federal presence was a standard response to a high-profile patient's surgical complication. He characterized the equipment failure as an isolated incident and described his own role as appropriate and procedurally compliant. Merritt looked at his coffee. He also sent a separate message to Callaway Regional's board chair recommending that Brooke Halstead's employment be terminated pending review on grounds of security violations and clinical overreach. She absorbed that without expression. The board chair forwarded it to the IG's office, which is where it belongs, Merritt said. The board chair has been cooperative since yesterday afternoon. How cooperative? Cooperative enough to agree to whatever we need for this morning. He looked at her. You holding up? I'm fine. That's not what I asked. She looked at him. The particular look she used for people who knew her well enough to ask real questions. Merritt was one of those people. He'd been one of those people for a long time, through contexts that made yesterday look manageable. I keep thinking about Tara's complaint, she said. October, 5 months ago. If it had gone anywhere. It might have prevented the Westfield death, he said. Maybe. Probably. Yes, he said. Probably. She looked at the break room wall. There was a schedule posted there, names and shifts in color-coded blocks. She could see Tara's name, Phillips, her own, added by someone in pencil at some point yesterday. This morning, she said. What do you need from me? Clinical expert, same as last night. Ferris is going to make arguments about acceptable variance in equipment performance. We need someone who can counter that in the room with enough specific authority that his attorney can't dismiss it. Does he have his attorney with him this morning? He's coming alone. He doesn't think he needs one. A pause that contained a kind of dark symmetry. He thinks he's coming to manage a situation. The meeting was in the governor's conference suite on the administrative floor, a proper room, not a converted family consultation space, with a table long enough for 8 people and a credenza along one wall and a view of the parking structure that nobody was looking at. The chief of staff, a sharp-faced woman named Andrea Voss, who had apparently been briefed overnight and was furious in the specific contained way of people who were very good at their jobs and had just discovered they'd been played, sat at the head of the table. Frost was there. Marsh was there. Cho was there. 2 IG investigators Brooke recognized from yesterday. Merritt stood near the door. Brooke sat at the far end of the table with a folder in front of her that contained the equipment calibration documentation, the complaint suppression timeline Cho had assembled overnight, and the clinical summary of the OR2 failure's effect on the governor's intraoperative status. At 9:03, Gerald Ferris opened the door and walked in. He was dressed professionally, gray suit, conservative tie, the presentation of a man who had prepared for an important meeting. He was carrying a leather portfolio that presumably contained whatever narrative he'd built for this conversation. He looked at the room, and his steps slowed for a half beat. Not a stop, just a register. Too many people. Wrong configuration. He looked at Brooke. Something moved behind his eyes. Very quick. Very controlled. Then he sat down. He sat because there was nothing else to do. He sat, and he opened his portfolio, and he looked at Andrea Voss and said, I appreciate the time. I know yesterday was difficult, and I wanted to provide a full operational picture before the investigation gets ahead of the public narrative. Mr. Ferris, Frost said. He stopped. We're not here for an operational briefing, Frost said. We're here because we have questions about your involvement in the Meridian Biomedical Solutions contract and your role in suppressing staff safety complaints at this facility. You have the right to have an attorney present. If you'd like to call one before we proceed, now is the time. The room was very quiet. Ferris looked at Frost, at Marsh, at the investigators, at Merritt by the door. His gaze moved around the table with the specific tracking of a man taking inventory and not finding the numbers he expected. He looked at Brooke last. I'm not sure I understand the nature of this meeting, he said. His voice was even. Impressive, actually. The kind of control that came from practice. I think you do, Frost said, but I'm going to walk you through it anyway. She laid the first document on the table and slid it toward him. The Meridian contract recommendation, with Yeager's signature and Kane's. She pointed to a third signature line, initialed rather than signed, that Brooke hadn't noticed in the conference room the night before. Ferris's initials. Internal routing approval, Frost said. Required under State Health Procurement Code. Any vendor contract above the facility threshold needs internal operational sign-off before it reaches the compliance stage. Your initials indicate you reviewed and approved this contract recommendation before it went to Yeager for certification. Ferris looked at the document. I review dozens of documents a month. I don't have specific recollection of the second document, Frost said. Cho placed it. A financial disclosure. Account statements, routing numbers, a transfer that had gone through a consulting firm and arrived in an account registered to a trust that contained Ferris's name. He looked at it, said nothing. Third document, Frost said. The complaint suppression record. Every internal staff complaint about equipment concerns at Callaway Regional over 18 months. Timestamps showing when they'd been received. No evidence of any escalation. And at the bottom of the log, a notation field that showed which administrator had last accessed each file. Ferris, 43 times. He put his hand flat on the table. His jaw was working slightly. Not speech, just the muscular indication of a man trying to find solid ground in a conversation that had none. I want to call my attorney, he said. Of course, Frost said. The meeting pauses. You can use the room next door. He stood. He picked up his portfolio. He walked to the door that Merritt held open, and Merritt followed him into the hallway. Brooke watched him go. She thought about the woman in Dunmore General 8 months ago. Cardiac arrest in an operating room, attributed to anesthesia complications. A family that had been told it was pre-existing condition risk. She thought about Tara putting a written complaint in the institutional system in October, with the particular faith of someone who believed the system might work. She thought about Philip, alone, finding an anonymous tip line and using it. How long will it take? She asked Frost, when Ferris was out of the room. His attorney will advise him to cooperate or not. If he cooperates today. If he doesn't, weeks. But the outcome is the same either way, just slower. Frost straightened the documents on the table. The financial trail is solid. The initials are his. Yeager gave us 4 months of direct communication with Ferris that documents the entire arrangement. What about the capital contact, the person at the State Facilities Board? Frost met her eyes. We made an arrest at 6 this morning, before Ferris arrived here. A pause. A man named Desmond Hoyt, Deputy Director of the State Health Facilities Compliance Board. He was the one who rubber-stamped the certifications and made them look legitimate. Brooke looked at the table. 3 names. 3 points of a structure that had run for nearly 2 years, approving defective equipment, suppressing complaints, collecting money, and leaving 2 people dead in operating rooms in other cities while the machinery of institutional trust provided cover. Hoyt made bail, Marsh said from across the table. He's restricted from contacting anyone in the state health network. His access has been suspended. She paused. He's already talking. His attorney made contact with our office at 5:30 this morning. Before Ferris got here, Brooke said. 40 minutes before, Marsh confirmed. The implication was clear. Hoyt had decided not to be the last one to the table. Chat. Ferris's attorney arrived at 9:51. By 10:40, Ferris was talking. He didn't give them everything at once. That wasn't how it worked. His attorney managed the disclosure in increments, testing each piece against what the investigators already had, calibrating how much cooperation bought, how much consideration. It was a negotiation dressed as a confession, and Frost let it run at that pace because the information was good and the corroboration was strong, and pushing harder would only give the attorney grounds to claim coercion. Brooke wasn't in the room for that part. She'd been thanked for her presence and released, which was how it should be. The clinical expert piece was done, and what happened in the room now was legal and prosecutorial and not her territory. She went back to the surgical floor. The floor was busier now. Mid-morning, the rhythm of the day fully underway, patients coming in from overnight, attending rounds in progress. She found Tara at the nurse's station and stood next to her for a moment without saying anything. Tara looked at her. Well? Ferris is in the administrative wing talking to investigators. Tara's hand went still on the chart she was writing, just for a second. How much trouble is he in? A lot, Brooke said. Tara set down her pen. She looked at the station, the charts, the monitors, the unremarkable functional machinery of a floor she'd been working for 8 years. October, she said. I filed that complaint in October. I know. I told myself it had gone somewhere, that someone was looking at it. She looked at the wall. I knew it hadn't. Brooke didn't offer anything soft about it. There wasn't anything soft that was also honest. You filed it anyway. That matters. Did it? Cho's document on the suppression record has your complaint as the first entry. It's what established the pattern for the investigative record. She looked at Tara directly. It mattered. Tara picked up her pen. looked at the chart, put the pen down again. The 2 people who died, she said, at the other hospitals. Yes. Did anybody file a complaint there before it happened? Brooke looked at her. I don't know the specifics, but the investigation started because someone at one of those facilities flagged something through a state oversight channel. And it still took 8 months. Yes, Brooke said. It did. She didn't say anything else. There wasn't anything she could add to the weight of that. They stood at the station for a moment, 2 nurses on a floor that was returning, incrementally and imperfectly, to something that worked. Then Tara picked up the pen and went back to the chart, and Brooke picked up the next one, and the morning moved forward. Bumped. At 1:15, Philip came to find her. He'd been quieter than usual all morning, not subdued exactly, but carrying something carefully. He found her in the post-op bay doing patient rounds and waited until she was finished with the chart before he spoke. The board chair wants to meet with nursing staff this afternoon, he said. Formal acknowledgement. He's calling it a staff consultation, but he stopped. It's not a consultation. It's the board trying to get ahead of however the investigation shapes the public story. When? 3 o'clock. Conference room A. She looked at him. He had the expression of someone who had something else to say and was deciding whether to say it. What? She said. The board chair's opening statement. His office sent a preview to the floor supervisors. He's naming the people who raised concerns. He paused. Your name is first. She absorbed this. Is Tara's name on there? Second. He looked at the floor. Mine isn't. She understood immediately. The anonymous tip meant anonymous. His name hadn't appeared in any of the formal documentation. The board chair's statement was working from what was visible in the record. Your tip is in the investigative file, she said. It's documented as the second formal complaint, submitted independently. Frost's office has it. My name isn't on it. Do you want it to be? He thought about this with the visible effort of a man doing real calculation about what something cost and what it was worth. I don't know, he said honestly. Then you have time to figure that out. The investigation isn't ending today. He nodded slowly. Are you going to the 3 o'clock? She looked at the post-op chart in her hands. I'm on shift until 7, she said. I'll go if the floor can spare me for 20 minutes. If it can't, I'll stay on the floor. Philip looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. Then he said, There's nobody like that around here. Most people would show up for the acknowledgement part. The patients aren't cleared for acknowledgement, she said. They're post-op. He made a sound that was almost a laugh and went back to his station. Oh. She was in the middle of a post-op assessment at 2:40 when Merritt appeared in the doorway of the room and waited. She finished the assessment, made the notation, and stepped into the hallway. Ferris gave them Hoyt's complete file, Merritt said. 2 years of correspondence, the payment structure, the mechanism they used to make the vendor certifications look legitimate, and one additional piece. What piece? Hoyt had a contact inside the state health insurance regulatory office who was running parallel approvals. Equipment purchased through Meridian was being fast-tracked through insurance pre-authorization, which generated premium reimbursements that went back into the payment structure. He paused. It wasn't just about getting the equipment into the hospitals. They were also collecting reimbursement on the equipment after it was installed. Some of the units had already failed or been flagged by the original vendor and were being relabeled and resold with new certification numbers. Brooke looked at him. The geometry of it was becoming clear in the expanded version. Not just corner cutting on procurement, not just suppressed complaints. A full fraud cycle. Install the equipment, collect reimbursement, suppress any evidence of failure, repeat. How many hospitals total? She said. We're at 7 now, possibly more as the file unravels. 7 hospitals. She thought about operating rooms in 7 facilities, equipment with false certification numbers, staff who had noticed something and tried to report it and found their complaints going nowhere. The Dunmore death, she said. And Westfield. And potentially a third that the Westfield investigators are looking at from 14 months ago, before the pattern was identifiable. His voice was flat and factual. The investigation is now a multi-jurisdictional operation. The state level handed the lead to federal oversight an hour ago. She looked at the hallway, the ordinary mid-afternoon bustle of a hospital floor, orderlies and residents, and the ambient noise of a place that was always doing too many things at once. "It's bigger than Callaway Regional," she said. "It always was," Merritt said. "Callaway Regional is where it became visible." She nodded. She thought about the parking structure Saturday morning, the flat gray light, the overcast sky, the two black SUVs turning into the access road, the text on her phone that said they're asking for you. It had felt, in that moment, like a narrow thing, a specific situation in a specific hospital with specific people who had done specific harm. It wasn't narrow. "The 3 o'clock meeting," she said. "The board is handling that. You don't need to be there." "I know." She paused. "I'm going anyway. 20 minutes. He looked at her. "Why?" "Because Tara is going to be in that room with people who are going to say things that are true and also incomplete. And Tara has been carrying this floor for 8 years, and she deserves to have someone in the room who knows the full picture." Merritt was quiet for a moment. "You've been here a week." 6 days. "And you already—" He stopped. "What?" He shook his head slightly. "Not disagreement, something else." "Nothing. Go. I'll find you at 4. She went. The board chair's name was Robert Alcott, and he was the kind of institutional leader who had learned to project accountability in the way that organizations projected it when accountability was being demanded of them, with warmth, with appropriate solemnity, with carefully chosen language that honored the concerns of the people in the room while preserving maximum flexibility for whatever came next. The room held about 20 people, nursing staff, a few residents, 2 department heads. Tara was in the second row. Philip was in the back standing. Alcott read from his prepared statement. He named Brooke first, as Philip had said, a formal acknowledgement of her role in the governor's surgical intervention and in flagging the equipment concerns. He named Tara second. He talked about the investigation in broad terms that disclosed nothing specific. He used words like systemic failure and accountability and commitment to transparency. None of it was wrong. Some of it was even right. But it had the texture of a document that had been written with one eye on the investigation and one eye on the institution's public position, and the people in the room who had been on this floor long enough could hear that texture. When he finished, he asked if there were questions. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Tara raised her hand. "I filed a written concern in October," she said, "about equipment on this floor. Where did it go?" Alcott's expression did something practiced. "All internal concerns are being reviewed as part of the investigation. We'll be providing staff with full transparency on complaint processing outcomes." "That's not what I asked." Tara's voice was even, not aggressive, just specific. "I asked where it went. Did it leave this floor?" Brooke watched Alcott handle this and knew the moment she was watching, the moment where an institution either disclosed or deflected, and whatever it chose in that moment was the thing the people in the room would carry with them. "Based on preliminary review," Alcott said carefully, "it appears the complaint was received by the facility's internal routing system and was not appropriately escalated. The individuals responsible for that failure are currently subjects of the investigation." "Ferris," Tara said. "Not a question." Alcott paused. "I'm not able to name individuals under active investigation." "You don't need to," Tara said. She looked at her lap for a moment, then she looked up. "I just needed to know it was real, that it went somewhere, even now." She paused. "That's all." The room was quiet. Alcott said something about commitment to staff feedback mechanisms and a new compliance review structure. Brooke stopped tracking it. She was looking at Tara, who was looking at the front of the room with the expression of a woman who had just received an answer that was unsatisfying and partial and had to decide whether to accept it as enough for now. She watched Tara make that decision, watched her sit with the weight of October and November and 5 months of wondering, and arrive somewhere on the other side of it that wasn't resolution but was at least ground. She slipped out at the 20-minute mark and went back to the floor. Merritt found her at 4, as he'd said. He had a different quality to his movement than he'd had at 3:30. Something resolved, a decision made. She saw it from the end of the hallway and knew before he reached her that something had changed. Yeager's attorney withdrew the cooperation framework, he said. She looked at him. Why? They got access to the full scope of what Ferris and Hoyt disclosed. Yeager's attorney did the math and decided his client's position was better served by pleading directly than by negotiating a cooperation discount. He paused. Which tells us the attorney knows the full scope of what Yeager did is worse than what Ferris and Hoyt disclosed about him. How much worse? We don't know yet, but Frost's office has a warrant for Yeager's personal accounts and devices. They execute it tonight. He looked at her steadily. It's possible, Frost thinks probable, that Yeager's involvement goes back further than the Meridian contract. There may be a prior arrangement with a different vendor, before Meridian, which would mean the timeline expands, she said. The timeline expands. She looked at the hallway, thought about what expanding the timeline meant. More facilities, more equipment, more complaints that went nowhere, more outcomes that might have been different. The governor, she said. He knows about this? Frost is with him now. Merritt's voice dropped slightly. He's taking it hard. Not the personal piece, the scope, the fact that it ran through his executive authority without his knowledge. She could imagine it, the specific helplessness of a man in a position of institutional power, discovering that the machinery operating in his name had been running a different program entirely. Is he going to be okay? She said. Merritt looked at her. Medically? Yes. Webb thinks so, barring complications. He paused. But he's not going to be okay for a while. He's going to have to face a public accounting of how this got past him, and that's going to be its own thing. She nodded. Merritt reached into his jacket and took out a folded document and held it out to her. This came through from the Federal Oversight Office an hour ago, formal. She unfolded it, read it. It was a document she recognized the structure of. She'd seen similar ones before, in different contexts, with different language. This one was longer than the authorization letter from yesterday. It had a different heading. She read it twice. When she looked up, Merritt was watching her. They want you as lead clinical consultant for the expanded investigation, she said. All 7 facilities. Yes. That's not a 6-day assignment. No, he said. It's not. She looked at the document. She thought about the motel off Route 9. She thought about the mountain and water print in the family consultation room. She thought about Tara at the nurse's station, Philip at the back of the room, with his name not on a list. Selvin connecting the transducer in 90 seconds with a line that wasn't hers. She thought about 7 hospitals and a pattern that had run for at least 2 years and possibly longer, and the people in operating rooms at those facilities who had noticed things and found nowhere to put them. I need to finish my shift, she said. Your shift ends at 7. Then I'll give you an answer at 7. He took the document back and folded it. Fair enough. He left. She went back to her charts. At 6:47, her phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't open it. She was mid-notation on a patient file and her hands were full. But she opened it. The text contained 4 words and an image. The words were, "You need to see this." The image was a photograph, grainy, taken at some distance, possibly from a phone camera. It showed a corridor she recognized as the hospital's administrative wing. 2 people standing close together in conversation, shot from behind. One of them, from the posture and the suit, was Yeager's attorney, Preston Vale. The other, she looked at the hair, the build, the particular way the person held their portfolio, was not someone she'd expected. It was Andrea Voss, the governor's chief of staff, the woman who had sat at the head of the table that morning and listened to Ferris walk into a trap, and who had, at some point between 9 a.m. and now, walked into the administrative wing to have a private conversation with the attorney of the man who had arranged the entire fraud. Brooke looked at the photo for a long time. Then she called Frost. Frost picked up on the second ring. Brooke described the photo in 30 seconds. The corridor, the 2 figures, the timestamp visible in the corner of the image. 4:47 p.m. 3 hours after Ferris had been walked into the investigator's room. 2 hours after Yeager's attorney had withdrawn the cooperation framework. Frost said, "Forward it to me now." Brooke did. There was a pause on the line, 40 seconds of background noise that sounded like a room with multiple people moving quickly. Then Frost came back. Who sent you this? Unknown number. I don't know who has it. It's Philip, Frost said. Brooke looked up from her phone toward the nurse's station. Philip was at his computer with his back to her, typing. He was in the administrative wing at 4:30 for a supply authorization signature, Frost said. He saw them in the corridor, recognized Vale from the morning meeting, and took the photo. A pause. He sent it to you because he trusts you, and he didn't know who else to call. She looked at Philip for another moment, the man who had said be careful about which flags you raise and to whom, who had filed an anonymous tip anyway, who had stood in the back of the room at 3 o'clock with his name off the public list and had still showed up. What does the photo mean for Voss? She said. It means we have a conversation tonight instead of tomorrow. Frost's voice had the specific quality of someone accelerating a timeline that had already been running fast. Get to the 4th floor. The governor needs to hear this from someone he's met before his chief of staff comes back to him with a version of it. Cress was awake when she arrived. Webb had reduced the monitoring to standard ICU protocol, which meant fewer leads in a quieter room, and someone had raised the bed so he was sitting higher than the last time she'd been here. He looked less gray. Not recovered, not close to it, but a man who had slept and eaten something and was running on something closer to his actual self. He looked at her when she came in, read her face. Sit down, he said. She sat. She told him about Voss and Vale. She told him about the photo, about the timing, about what it likely meant. She didn't soften any of it. He was 61 years old and the governor of a state, and he didn't need it softened. What he needed was the information, which she gave him directly. He listened the way he'd listened the night before. Still, controlled. The right hand tight on the bed rail. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Andrea has been my chief of staff for 4 years, he said. Not defensively, just placing it. I know. She had access to the Modernization Initiative files from the beginning. She would have known about the advisory panel, the certification framework, the vendor selection criteria. He looked at the wall. She would have known about everything I signed. Yes. Another silence. She watched him sit with it. The specific weight of discovering that proximity and trust had been operating as cover for something else, and that the cover had been close enough that he'd never thought to look at it. Is she going to try to contact me? He said. Probably, before Frost's office moves. He looked at Brooke directly. If she does? Don't answer. Text Frost first. He nodded. Then, you drove here from a motel off Route 9 this morning at 5 a.m. The shift surprised her slightly. Yes. You've been on your feet for, he looked at the clock on the wall, 15 hours. About that. And you're here at 7 p.m. to tell me something you could have had anyone deliver. She thought about how to answer. Frost asked me to be the one who told you. Why? Because I'm the person you've already decided to trust, and what you're hearing needed to come from that. She paused. Also because I wanted to tell you myself. He looked at her. Why? Because you should know the full picture, she said. Not the version that gets cleaned up for a press release or a briefing document. The full one. You almost died on a table yesterday because people in your institution decided that money was worth more than the process you trusted them to run. You deserve to understand the exact shape of what that was. He held her gaze for a long moment. That's a very particular kind of respect, he said. It's the only kind I know how to do, she said. Frost moved on Voss at 8:15. It wasn't an arrest, not initially. It was a formal interview request delivered in person by Marsh and one of the IG investigators in Voss's office on the 2nd floor of the administrative wing. The interview lasted 40 minutes. At the end of it, Voss's attorney, who arrived 22 minutes in suggesting the attorney had already been on standby, negotiated a voluntary cooperation arrangement. Voss had not been a principal architect. That much became clear quickly. She had been a conduit, someone with access to the governor's schedule, his correspondence, his executive authorization workflow, who had been passing information to Vale for 11 months in exchange for considerations that the financial investigators would spend the next 3 weeks fully documenting. She hadn't known about the deaths. That was the investigators' assessment, and Brooke had no reason to doubt it. Ignorance of downstream consequences didn't excuse the upstream choices, but it was a meaningful distinction in what came next. What came next for Voss was the end of her career in public service and the beginning of a legal process that would take years to resolve. She resigned at 9 o'clock that evening. The statement her attorney released said she was stepping down to address personal matters. Nobody in the building believed it. Nobody was supposed to. The press conference was 12 days later. Not because it took that long for the investigation to reach a conclusion, it was nowhere near concluded, but because that was how long the governor's medical team required before Webb cleared him for 30 minutes of standing at a podium. Webb had been specific. 30 minutes? No more. And someone was going to be standing close enough to intervene if his color went wrong. Brooke was not supposed to attend. She was in the middle of her third week of consulting work, which had taken her twice to the Dunmore facility and once to Westfield, and the day of the press conference, she'd been scheduled for a debrief call with the federal investigative team at 2 o'clock that she'd been preparing for since the previous evening. Merritt rescheduled the debrief. She found out 40 minutes before the press conference, when he appeared in the doorway of the temporary office the hospital had allocated to her, a converted storage room on the second floor with a desk and a chair and a window that looked at a brick wall, and said, "You need to be downstairs. The debrief is at 5. You need to be downstairs." The press conference was in the hospital's main lobby, which had been cleared of the usual furniture and arranged with a podium and a cluster of media cameras and about 60 people who represented various institutional, medical, and governmental interests in what had happened here. The governor's office had coordinated with the hospital board, the state IG, and the federal oversight team. Alcott was there. Frost was there. 2 of the state's senior health officials were there. 3 of the nursing staff who had filed the complaints that fed into the investigation had been specifically invited. Tara, Philip, and a woman from the Dunmore facility named Rhea Vasquez, who had filed a concern 8 months ago that had been the first link in the chain the investigators had assembled. Brooke stood near the back. She dressed for the debrief rather than the press conference. Practical clothes, nothing that anticipated being seen. She was standing next to Merritt, who was in his jacket with the insignia, and next to Tara, who had put on her scrubs for this because she was going back to the floor afterward, and had decided with characteristic practicality that this was the right choice. Kress came in from a side door. He was moving more steadily than she'd expected. The 12 days had done visible work. He still had the ICU pallor, still moved with the careful deliberateness of someone aware of a sternum that had been opened and closed, but he was upright and present, and his eyes were sharp. He went to the podium. He spoke for 22 minutes, 8 minutes less than his cleared limit, which was either genuine brevity or the lingering influence of political training. He covered the investigation in terms that were specific without being prosecutorial, acknowledging the scope of the fraud, the deaths at Dunmore and Westfield, the suppression of staff complaints, and the involvement of individuals at multiple levels of the state health system. He named no names. The legal process was ongoing, and his attorneys had been clear about that boundary. But the shape of what he described left no ambiguity about what had happened. Then he said, "I want to speak about the people who tried to stop this before I had the chance to." He named Tara first, spoke about her October complaint and the specific professional courage it took to file a formal concern in an environment that had been deliberately structured to discourage it. Tara, from where Brooke was standing, did something with her jaw that looked like she was working very hard not to change her expression. He named Philip second, named him specifically and publicly, which answered the question Philip had been sitting with for 12 days. His attorney had made the determination that his cooperation and his early tip made anonymity no longer his best protection, and the recognition was, in the end, something he'd decided he could accept. Philip, at the back of the room, looked at the floor. He named Rhea Vasquez from Dunmore, who had filed a complaint that went nowhere and had filed a second one 3 months later, and a third, and had kept filing despite never receiving a response, because she had decided that the absence of response was not the same as the absence of record. Then he looked toward the back of the room. "And I want to speak about a woman who had been on this floor for 6 days, he said. 6 days. She didn't know the history. She didn't know the politics. She saw warning signs in the equipment. She raised them through every available channel, And when every available channel was closed to her, she made one phone call to someone she trusted, and she went and sat in a parking structure and waited. He paused. She stabilized me on that table. Dr. Kane completed the surgery. Dr. Webb kept me alive through the anesthesia. Diane Solis ran the bypass. But the conditions under which all of that was possible, the intervention that changed the outcome before it became irreversible, that was Brooke Halstead. 60 people were looking at her. She didn't move. She had the particular stillness of someone who was not comfortable with what was happening and was choosing to receive it anyway, because refusing it would be its own kind of statement. And this moment was not about her comfort. I've been told, Kress continued, that when someone asked her how she stayed calm under that kind of pressure, she said she didn't stay calm. She stayed functional. He looked at her directly. I think that's the most honest thing I've heard from anyone in this building in a long time. The cameras turned toward her. She looked back at them steadily. The formal acknowledgments came in the following weeks, and she received them the way she received most things, practically, without making a production of them. The state's civilian medical commendation, a letter from the Federal Oversight Office that went into a file, a formal reinstatement of her employment at Callaway Regional, which was now operating under interim administration while a new permanent leadership structure was assembled under oversight. Kane had surrendered his license voluntarily while the investigation into his procurement involvement concluded, a choice his attorney had apparently advised as the most defensible position given what the evidence showed. He'd signed a document he shouldn't have signed, and he'd trusted an assurance he should have verified, and what happened next was going to take the better part of a year to fully adjudicate. The OR work he'd done to complete the governor's repair remained on his record as what it was, technically excellent. Everything else was what it was too. Yeager's personal account review revealed an additional layer, a prior arrangement with a different equipment vendor that predated Meridian by 14 months, establishing a pattern of falsified approvals that now anchored a separate fraud count. He'd been the one who'd approached Ferris initially, which the investigators had suspected, and Ferris's cooperation confirmed. He was facing multiple counts across jurisdictions, and his attorney had long since abandoned any pretense of a defensible narrative. Ferris pled guilty. Hoyt pled guilty. Voss cooperated and was charged with a reduced count that her attorney was contesting. The Meridian equipment was pulled from all 7 facilities. A federal remediation process was underway. The families of the patients who had died in Dunmore and Westfield were in contact with legal counsel, and the state was facing civil exposure that the governor's office had acknowledged directly and publicly, which was itself notable. None of it was clean. None of it resolved into the neat category of justice that people wanted when they heard a story like this one. The legal process was slow, and the grief was permanent, and the institutional changes that were supposed to prevent recurrence were going to require sustained attention for years before anyone could honestly say they were working. Brooke understood this. She'd always understood that the outcome of doing the right thing was not a perfect world. It was a different one, sometimes marginally better, always more complicated than it looked from the outside. She accepted the consultant role with the federal oversight team for a period of 12 months, which meant she was embedded at Callaway Regional during that time. And she used that embeddedness the way she'd used every other environment she'd ever worked in, systematically cataloging what worked and what didn't, asking the people who actually ran the floor what they needed rather than assuming she already knew. Tara became the floor's interim nursing director 3 weeks after the investigation became public. She accepted the role with the specific reluctance of someone who understood exactly what it would cost and had decided the cost was worth it. Philip, who had been offered a formal recognition role on the state's new Whistleblower Protection Committee, took 3 weeks to decide and then said yes. He told Brooke afterward that he'd spent those 3 weeks trying to figure out if he deserved it. "That's the wrong question," she said. "What's the right one?" She thought about it. "Whether the thing needs doing, and whether you're one of the people who can." He looked at her. "That's a pretty high bar." "Yes," she said. "It is one." On a Thursday in late April, 6 weeks after the press conference, Brooke sat in the break room at 7:10 in the morning with a cup of coffee that was marginally better than it had been in March. Someone had replaced the machine, and Tara came in and sat across from her without asking. Ria Vasquez from Dunmore is coming in next week, Tara said. The federal team wants a joint debrief with both of us and the Westfield nurse who filed the third complaint. I know, I scheduled it. She's nervous, hasn't been in a formal setting like that before. I'll call her before she comes in. Tara looked at her coffee. She asked me about you, whether you were... She paused. She wanted to know if you were the kind of person who made her feel like she'd done enough. Brooke looked at her. What did you tell her? I told her you were the kind of person who told you what was true. Tara looked up. Which is not always the same thing, but it's more useful. Brooke thought about that. Is that what she needs? Probably not. Probably she needs someone to tell her she did enough. Tara's voice was quiet. But she needs the true thing more. Then that's what I'll give her. They sat in the break room with their bad but less bad coffee while the floor outside began its morning routines. The shift change, the charts, the ordinary machinery of a place that was putting itself back together with the imperfect materials available, which were the only materials there ever were. Brooke thought about a question Selvin had asked her the morning after the surgery. How do you stay that calm? And the answer she'd given, I don't. I stay functional. She still thought that was accurate. But sitting here, in this particular break room, in this particular building, 6 weeks past the day she'd driven into a hospital parking structure with a suspended badge and a single phone call's worth of faith that something would move, she thought there was something else she hadn't said. Functional wasn't the whole of it. You stayed functional because there were people on the other side of your breaking down who couldn't afford for you to break. That was the truth underneath the combat training and the clinical calm and the ability to read a waveform and know whether to hold. It wasn't discipline exactly. It was the particular consequence of caring enough about the outcome that your own discomfort became secondary information. She'd been cared for that way, in other rooms, by other people. Merit, more than once. Others she didn't think about daily, but whose steadiness had mattered in ways she couldn't fully quantify. She'd learned it the way most people learned the things that shaped them, by being on the receiving end of it first. The fraud she'd walked into at Callaway Regional hadn't started with Yeager or Ferris or Hoyt. It had started, as these things always started, with people deciding that no one was watching closely enough to matter. That the nurses would file complaints and the complaints would go nowhere, and the pattern would continue because the people inside it had structured the environment to absorb exactly that kind of quiet resistance without registering it as a threat. They'd been right for a while. Tara had filed and nothing had moved. Philip had filed anonymously and waited. Ria Vasquez had filed 3 times in Dunmore and received no response. And then someone had arrived who'd been somewhere else, who had a phone number that connected to a different kind of authority, who had walked through the door with no history in this building and therefore no stake in its internal politics, and who had looked at a calibration sticker and thought, this is wrong, and I'm going to say so, even if they make it hard for me. The dangerous thing about people who were used to being dismissed was that they sometimes became, over time, the only ones still watching. Because everyone else had learned it wasn't worth it. She wasn't a hero. She knew that. Heroes existed in the version of this story that got told at press conferences. What she was, more accurately, was someone who had been trained to pay attention and had found, after 2 deployments and years of civilian work and a motel off Route 9 and 6 days in a hospital that didn't want her there, that she still couldn't stop. That was the thing nobody warned you about. When you built yourself around noticing what was wrong and trying to fix it, you couldn't turn it off. It went with you into every room, every floor, every institution you walked through. It cost you things. It made certain kinds of ease unavailable. But it also meant that on a Saturday in March, with a suspended badge in a parking structure and the flat gray light of a sky about to rain, you could look at 2 black SUVs turning into a hospital access road and know that what you'd done was right, and hold that knowledge quietly without needing anyone else to say it first. She finished her coffee, put the cup in the sink, picked up the chart from the stack Tara had left on the counter. First patient of the morning, a 53-year-old man 3 days post-op from a valve repair, stable but worth checking, and walked back out to the floor. The work was still there. It was always still there. She went to do it.